Imagine you're walking down a busy street in London. Maybe it's Oxford Street, crowded with shoppers, cars honking, the smell of coffee and exhaust mixing in the air. Or maybe you're in Manhattan, concrete and steel rising around you, the subway rumbling beneath your feet. Maybe you're in Mumbai, in Tokyo, in Cairo. Pick any coastal city you know. Now look down at the pavement beneath your shoes, under that asphalt, under the pipes and cables and ancient sewers, under the medieval foundations and Roman roads. There's something else, something older, something we've forgotten. Go down far enough, deep enough, and you'd find landscapes that haven't seen daylight in 12,000 years. River valleys where people once lived, beaches where children played, forests where hunters tracked game that doesn't exist anymore. All of it drowned, buried, erased by water that came and never left. This isn't mythology. This isn't speculation. This actually happened. And if you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is. I love checking the comments and seeing Melbourne at dawn, Chicago at midnight, London during lunch. All of us scattered across a planet that looks nothing like it did when our ancestors were alive. Today, we think of coastlines as permanent, the edge of the land, the beginning of the sea, fixed, unchanging. But 12,000 years ago, you wouldn't recognize the world map. The oceans were 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet. That's a 40-story building of vertical distance. Entire continents of land that are underwater now were above the surface then, and people lived there, thrived there, built lives and cultures and accumulated knowledge for thousands of years on coastlines that simply don't exist anymore. This is the story of the flood that humanity never recovered from. Not one catastrophic event, but centuries of rising water that drowned the ancient world and forced our species to become something entirely different. We didn't just survive this catastrophe, we were permanently, fundamentally transformed by it. Everything that came after, cities, agriculture, writing, civilization itself, all of it was built by the descendants of climate refugees who watched their world disappear beneath the waves. And to understand what we lost, what we'll never get back, we need to see the world as it was before the waters came. Let's go back 20,000 years. Not to visit, but to understand what was stolen from us when the ice melted and the seas rose, and an entire version of Earth ceased to exist. Picture the coastlines as they were during the last ice age. If you could somehow look at Earth from space 20,000 years ago, you'd see continents you wouldn't recognize. Not because the land itself was different, but because so much more of it was exposed. The oceans had retreated. Sea level sat roughly 400 feet, 120 meters lower than today. All that water was locked away in ice sheets miles thick, covering huge portions of the northern hemisphere. And where the water had been, where our modern oceans now sit, there was land. Vast stretches of coastal plain, river valleys, forests, grasslands. Territory that was, by almost every measure, the best real estate on the planet. This drowned world had names, though most people have never heard them. Doggerland, the massive plain that connected Britain to continental Europe. Not a narrow land bridge, but a country-sized landscape with its own rivers and hills and ecosystems. 20,000 years ago, you could walk from what's now London to Paris without ever seeing the ocean. The North Sea didn't exist. It was a plain, rich and fertile, stretching for hundreds of miles. The Thames and the Rhine weren't separate river systems emptying into different seas. They were tributaries of the same massive river that flowed north across Doggerland, before finally reaching the Atlantic somewhere far beyond where the modern coastline stands. Imagine standing in the middle of Doggerland in, say, 18,000 BCE. You're in the heart of what will one day be underwater, buried under the North Sea, but right now it's dry land as far as you can see. Rolling hills covered in grass, clusters of birch and pine trees along the riverbanks, herds of horses grazing in the distance, red deer moving through the forest edges, and people, your people, families living in seasonal camps near the rivers, following game animals, fishing for salmon and pike, gathering hazelnuts and berries when the season is right. This isn't a marginal environment where humans are barely scraping by. This is abundance. This is paradise. Or travel east to Southeast Asia. Today you see Indonesia, a scattered archipelago of islands separated by deep ocean channels. Malaysia and the Philippines and Borneo, all distinct, all isolated from each other by water. But 20,000 years ago, there was no separation. They were all connected, all part of one enormous landmass called Sunderland. The South China Sea, that vast body of water, it didn't exist. It was land. Tropical forests, river systems, coastal plains that extended hundreds of miles beyond the modern shoreline. You could walk from Malaysia to Java to Borneo without ever getting your feet wet. Sunderland was bigger than India, nearly 2 million square kilometres of territory that simply vanished when the seas rose. Picture yourself there in that lost world. The air is warm, humid, rich with the smell of vegetation and salt spray from the distant actual coastline. You're standing in a forest that will one day be 100 feet underwater. Monkeys call from the canopy above. You hear the rush of a river nearby, one of dozens that drain the interior highlands and flow across the exposed shelf toward the sea. The ocean is there, you can reach it if you walk south for several days, but it's distant, remote, not the immediate presence it would become after the flood. This is the heart of Sunderland, and it's home to people who have been here for thousands of years. They know these forests intimately. They know which plants are edible, which ones heal, which ones kill. They've developed technologies for tropical living that we'll never fully understand because all the evidence is now underwater, scattered across the seafloor, destroyed by 12,000 years of currents and sediment. Or consider the Persian Gulf. Today, it's a body of water, a sea separating Arabia from Iran, one of the most important waterways in the modern world for oil transport and geopolitics. But during the Ice Age, it didn't exist as water at all. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates, rivers that would later define Mesopotamia, they flowed south through what's now the Gulf, joined by other rivers from the surrounding highlands, creating one of the largest river systems in the region. The valley floor was fertile, well-watered, probably green and productive, and we have every reason to believe people lived there, perhaps even thrived there, developing early forms of agriculture or animal domestication in an environment that was perfect for such experiments. But when the seas rose, when the ice melted and the ocean came flooding back, that entire valley drowned. Everything that was there, every settlement, every potential early city, every innovation those people might have developed, it's all underwater now, under hundreds of feet of ocean, completely inaccessible to archaeology. This pattern repeated all over the world. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, they were all connected during the Ice Age, one continuous landmass called Sahel. You could walk from Melbourne to Port Moresby. The Bering Strait between Asia and North America didn't exist. In its place was Beringia, a vast grassland 1,000 miles wide, where mammoths and bison grazed and humans crossed freely between continents. The Mediterranean coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions. The Atlantic coast of North America, Europe, Africa, all of them were miles, sometimes tens of miles, farther out than they are today. And here's what you need to understand about these drowned landscapes. They weren't barren wastelands. They weren't marginal territory that happened to be above water. They were, by almost every ecological measure, the richest, most productive environments on the planet. Continental shelves, the underwater extensions of continents, they're shallow regions where nutrients concentrate. Even today, when they're submerged, they're incredibly productive marine ecosystems. Some of the world's greatest fisheries exist on continental shelves because the shallow water, the nutrient flow from rivers, and the mixing of ocean currents create perfect conditions for life. During the Ice Age, when these shelves were exposed as dry land, they would have been even more productive. River valleys cutting through the plains, creating diverse habitats, coastal forests benefiting from moderate maritime climates, grasslands supporting massive herds of grazing animals, lakes and marshes rich with waterfowl, and all of it easily accessible to humans who had been evolving sophisticated hunting and gathering strategies for hundreds of thousands of years. The people living on these coasts had every advantage. They had access to both terrestrial and marine resources, hunting on land, fishing in rivers and along the actual coastline. They had reliable fresh water from rivers fed by distant glaciers and mountain snowpack. They had moderate temperatures, kept mild by proximity to the ocean, avoiding the extreme cold of the continental interiors and the extreme heat of inland deserts. They had natural harbours, estuaries, protected bays perfect for developing maritime technologies. And they had what might be the most important resource of all, predictability. Coastal environments are stable. The resources are reliable season after season. Fish runs happen on schedules you can predict. Shellfish don't migrate. Seabirds return to the same nesting sites every year. This predictability allows for planning, for accumulated knowledge, for cultural sophistication. You don't need to be nomadic if the food comes to you. And we know people were living there, on these now drowned coasts, in large numbers. We know this not from direct evidence, because most of that evidence is underwater, but from logic and from the fragmentary clues we've managed to recover. Fishing trawlers working the North Sea have pulled up stone tools, bone artifacts, worked antlers, all dredged from what used to be Doggerland. These aren't isolated finds. They're scattered across the entire region, suggesting widespread occupation. Underwater surveys off the coast of India have found what might be structural remains, though the evidence is controversial and hard to interpret. Submerged sites in the Mediterranean show clear signs of human habitation, settlements that were occupied for generations before rising seas forced their abandonment. But here's the tragedy. Here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. We're only seeing the tiniest fraction of what was there, probably less than 1%, maybe far less than that. The vast majority of late Ice Age coastal sites are now under 100 feet, 200 feet, sometimes 400 feet of ocean. They're covered by marine sediment. They've been scoured by 12,000 years of currents, storms and tidal action. The organic materials, the wood and fibre and skin that would tell us so much about how these people lived, it's all decomposed. What remains, if anything remains, is scattered stone tools and the occasional bone that happened to get buried in sediment quickly enough to preserve. This means we're looking at Ice Age humanity through a fundamentally distorted lens. The archaeological sites we find, the ones we study and write about and use to reconstruct what life was like 20,000 years ago, they're almost all inland. They're the places that weren't drowned when the seas rose. But those inland sites, they might not be representative of the mainstream Ice Age culture. They might be the peripheral sites, the seasonal camps, the secondary territories, the heartland, the core populations, the most sophisticated and successful communities. They were probably on the coasts. And we'll never know what they achieved because it's all underwater. Think about what this means. If you wanted to judge modern human civilization, but you could only study sites from inland Montana, or the Australian outback, or the Sahara Desert, would you get an accurate picture? Would you understand cities, universities, technologies, the full scope of human achievement? Or would you conclude that humans in the 21st century were small, scattered populations, living simple lives with limited technology? That's the situation we're in with Ice Age humanity. We're studying the equivalent of the remote outback and concluding that's what everyone was like. But the equivalent of our cities, our centres of innovation and population, they're all underwater. We can make educated guesses about what we're missing. We know from the inland sites that Ice Age humans had sophisticated tool technologies. They were creating specialised tools for specific tasks, showing detailed understanding of materials and mechanics. They had art, cave paintings in France and Spain that demonstrate not just technical skill but abstract thinking, symbolic representation, possible religious or ceremonial purposes. They had long-distance trade networks. Materials like obsidian and seashells show up hundreds of miles from their sources, proving that different groups were in contact, exchanging goods, sharing information. They had complex social organizations capable of coordinating large hunting expeditions to take down mammoths and other megafauna. Now take all that sophistication and imagine it concentrated in coastal environments where resources were more abundant, where populations could be denser, where maritime travel made communication easier over longer distances. What would you get? Probably something far more advanced than the scattered inland sites suggest. Maybe early forms of permanent settlement, since coastal resources were reliable enough that you didn't need to move constantly. Maybe specialised occupations, where some people focused on fishing while others hunted or made tools or prepared food. Maybe more complex social hierarchies, with leaders who coordinated resource distribution and conflict resolution. Maybe even early experiments with cultivating plants or managing animal populations, the precursors to agriculture that wouldn't fully develop until after the flood forced people into river valleys. Or maybe something else entirely. Maybe technological innovations we've never imagined because we have no evidence they ever existed. Advanced boat building, navigation techniques that would have allowed coastal peoples to travel hundreds of miles by sea, creating networks we don't know about connecting populations across vast distances, architectural techniques using materials that don't preserve, wood, bamboo, palm fronds, creating structures more sophisticated than the simple shelters we find evidence for inland. Textile production, if they'd figured out how to process plant fibers or animal hair into thread and fabric. Food preservation methods that would have allowed them to store surplus fish or gathered plants, creating the first stored wealth, the first inequality, the first need for social systems to manage distribution. We'll probably never know. The drowned world took its secrets with it, but the little evidence we have, the logic of human behaviour, the understanding of what coastal environments offer, all of it points to the same conclusion. The best, most successful, most sophisticated human cultures of the Ice Age lived on coasts that are now 400 feet underwater. We're not looking at the pinnacle of Ice Age achievement when we study archaeological sites. We're looking at what was left after the floods took everything else, and those coastal peoples living in their paradise of abundance and moderate climate and reliable resources, they had no idea what was coming. How could they? The world had been stable for thousands of years. The climate had its variations, sure, but nothing catastrophic. The coastline was where it had always been, where it had been for countless generations. The ice sheets far to the north were just a permanent feature of the world, like mountains or deserts, eternal, unchanging. The idea that the ocean could rise, that the landscape itself could be transformed beyond recognition, it wasn't something you'd predict. It wasn't something anyone had ever seen. But change was coming, subtle at first, barely noticeable, but building with inexorable momentum toward the catastrophe that would end their world and force humanity to become something different, something we've never recovered from becoming. Around 15,000 years ago, something changed. Nothing dramatic at first, nothing you'd notice if you were living through it year by year, but the planet's orbital geometry, those slow cycles that control how much solar radiation different parts of Earth receive, they were shifting. The northern hemisphere was getting slightly more sunlight during summer, not enough to melt snow as it fell, but enough that the massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe stopped growing. They'd been advancing for 80,000 years, spreading south, thickening, covering more territory, with each passing millennium. Now they paused, stabilized, and then, almost imperceptibly, they began to retreat. Imagine you're living in what will one day be called France, around 14,800 years ago. You're part of a small group, maybe 30 people, extended family mostly, following herds of reindeer as they migrate between summer and winter grazing grounds. Your ancestors have been doing this for as long as anyone can remember. Countless generations living the same life, using the same routes, hunting the same animals. But lately things have been different. Subtle differences that your elders talk about around fires, comparing their memories to stories their grandparents told them. The winters aren't quite as long as they used to be. The spring melt comes a bit earlier each year. Plants your grandmother said only grew in the southern valleys, you're seeing them here now, spreading north. The reindeer herds seem restless, migrating earlier, moving farther north than the old routes accounted for. And the glacier, that wall of ice that marks the northern boundary of the world, it's changed. The edge has moved back. Not much, maybe the distance you could walk in half a day, but it's moved. Your grandfather swears the ice face used to be closer. He remembers camping sites that are now farther from the glacier than they were when he was young. You don't know it, but you're witnessing the end of the Ice Age. The long freeze that gripped the planet for 80 millennia is breaking. The ice sheets are melting, and all that frozen water, all those millions of cubic miles of ice, it has to go somewhere. The warming happened in stages, not smoothly. Around 14,600 years ago, temperatures jumped, not gradually over centuries, but relatively fast. Within a few human lifetimes, average temperatures in the northern hemisphere rose by 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but when you're talking about planetary climate, about ice sheets that are 2 miles thick and cover millions of square miles, a few degrees makes an enormous difference. It's the difference between ice that accumulates year after year and ice that melts faster than new snow can replace it. The glaciers began weeping. That's really what it looked like, what it sounded like if you were close enough. The ice faces that had been solid and static for thousands of years started producing meltwater. Streams flowing from beneath the ice, carrying glacial sediment, carving channels, rivers forming where there had been only ice, lakes pooling in depressions on the glacier surface, bright blue in the summer sun, water sitting on top of ice, something that would have been impossible during the coldest periods. And the meltwater had to go somewhere. It flowed downhill following gravity, collecting in rivers that swelled beyond their usual spring flood levels, and eventually, inevitably, it reached the ocean. The first sea level rise was subtle, maybe a few inches per decade, maybe a bit more in some regions. Nothing you'd notice unless you lived on the coast and paid very close attention to high tide markers. But it was happening. The ocean was starting to reclaim the land it had lost during the Ice Age. Then, around 14,600 years ago, something changed more dramatically. Geologists call it meltwater pulse 1a. What it means in practical terms is that within a span of maybe 300 to 500 years, global sea levels rose by 50 feet. 50 feet. That's 5 stories of vertical rise in what amounts to, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. If you were living on the coast during this period, you'd definitely notice. The beach where your parents built their summer fishing camp, it's underwater now. The tidal flats where you collected shellfish as a child, they're permanently submerged. The freshwater spring your family has used for generations, it's been contaminated by salt water. High tides are reaching farther inland than anyone has ever seen. And it's not stopping. Every year the water seems higher. Every decade more land is lost. The coastal peoples faced impossible choices. Some moved inland, abandoning territories their families had occupied for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Retreating to higher ground, competing with inland populations for hunting territories and resources. Others tried to adapt in place, moving their camps back from the encroaching water, accepting that the geography of their world was changing. But the psychological impact must have been profound. The ocean was supposed to be constant. The boundary between land and water was supposed to be fixed. Now that fundamental rule of the world was breaking down. Nothing was permanent anymore. The megafauna were under pressure too. The animals that had dominated the Ice Age, the massive herbivores that humans had been hunting for millennia, they were struggling. Mammoths, evolved for cold grasslands and tundra, found their habitat changing. As temperatures rose, the grasslands they depended on were being replaced by forests. Spruce and birch spreading north, taking over territory that had been open steppe, and mammoths couldn't easily adapt. They were specialized, evolved for specific environments that were now disappearing. Giant ground sloths in the Americas, some species weighing as much as modern elephants, they were facing similar pressures. Their food sources were changing, shifting in ways that didn't match their slow, reproductive rates and specialized diets. Cave bears in Europe, massive predators that had ruled Ice Age ecosystems, they were running out of territory. Woolly rhinoceroses, saber-toothed cats, giant armadillo-like creatures called glyptodonts, all of them were showing signs of stress. Populations declining, geographic ranges shrinking, genetic evidence suggesting they were inbreeding, losing diversity. And humans were part of the pressure. We'd been hunting these animals for tens of thousands of years, but during the Ice Age, when megafauna populations were large and widespread, hunting hadn't been a significant threat to their survival. Now, with populations already stressed by climate change, with habitats fragmenting, human hunting might have been the final straw for some species. Mammoths in particular were being hit hard. They were large, slow reproducing, and provided enormous amounts of meat and materials when successfully killed. Human populations had developed sophisticated strategies for hunting them, coordinated group efforts that could bring down even healthy adults. The combination of rapid climate change and human hunting pressure created what biologists call an extinction filter. Species that couldn't adapt fast enough, that couldn't shift their ranges or change their diets or adjust to new environments, they went extinct. And the larger the animal, the more specialized its requirements, the more vulnerable it was. Over the next several thousand years, the majority of megafauna species would disappear. Not gradually, not spread out over millions of years like previous extinction events, but concentrated in this narrow window of time when the climate was shifting and humans were spreading across every habitable continent. But there was another consequence of the melting ice, one that humans at the time couldn't possibly have understood. As the massive ice sheets retreated, as billions of tons of ice turned into water and flowed toward the ocean, some of that water didn't reach the sea immediately. It got trapped. held back by ice dams, natural barriers where glacial ice blocked river valleys, creating massive lakes. Picture this. You're in what will one day be called Montana, around 13,000 years ago. To the west and north you can see mountains, and beyond them, the edge of the ice sheet that still covers much of Canada. You don't venture that far north. Nobody does. It's too cold, too barren, and besides, there are stories about the ice. Strange sounds, groaning and cracking, areas where the ground shakes, places where massive floods of water occasionally burst out without warning, scouring valleys, destroying everything in their path. Your people avoid those regions. What you don't know, what nobody knows, is that behind the ice, in valleys you've never seen, water is accumulating. Glacial Lake Missoula, forming in what's now western Montana, dammed by a lobe of ice pushing south from the main ice sheet. The lake is enormous, over 3,000 square kilometers at its maximum extent, containing more than 2,000 cubic kilometers of water. That's roughly half the volume of all the modern Great Lakes combined, sitting behind an ice dam that's hundreds of feet high, but fundamentally unstable. Ice doesn't make good dams, not permanently. Ice floats. If the water gets deep enough, if it reaches a critical threshold, the ice dam can fail catastrophically. The buoyant force of the water literally lifts the ice, creating a gap underneath, and then the water starts flowing. Once it starts, it doesn't stop. The flowing water melts more ice, widening the gap, increasing the flow. Within hours, the dam can go from solid to completely breached, and then billions of gallons of water that's been building up for years or decades or centuries, it all escapes at once. Glacial Lake Missoula would fail and reform multiple times over the next few thousand years. Each time it filled and broke, creating floods of almost incomprehensible scale. But during this early warming period, around 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, these ice-dammed lakes were just forming, just beginning to accumulate water, loading the gun, you might say, even though nobody knew the trigger was being pulled. Further east, an even larger lake was forming, Glacial Lake Agassiz, named after the geologist Louis Agassiz, who would study its remnants thousands of years later. This wasn't just a large lake. At its maximum extent, Agassiz would cover an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, over 1 million square kilometers of surface area, containing enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters if it all drained at once. And like Missoula, it was held in place by ice dams, lobes of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet blocking the natural drainage paths, forcing water to accumulate in the basin that's now Manitoba and Ontario and parts of the northern United States. For now, the dams held. The water kept rising, and the people living downstream, in river valleys that would one day experience floods beyond anything in human memory, they had no idea they were living in the target zone. Europe had its own ice-dammed lakes forming as the Fennoscandian ice sheet retreated. Asia had them in Siberia and the Himalayas. Anywhere you had large glaciers retreating in mountainous or hilly terrain, you had the potential for ice dams and trapped meltwater. The planet was essentially covered in time bombs, though they ticked silently, invisibly, giving no warning of what they would eventually unleash. But for the people living through this early warming period, the changes seemed manageable. Challenging, yes. The climate was shifting, the animals were acting strangely, the coastlines were moving. But it wasn't apocalyptic. Not yet. Humans are adaptable. We're good at adjusting to changing circumstances, and the changes were slow enough, spread over enough generations, that each generation could adapt to its new normal without feeling like the world was ending. Your grandfather remembered when winters were longer. You remember when the reindeer herds were larger. Your children will remember when certain plants were more common, each generation adapting, adjusting, finding new strategies for survival. And in some ways, things were getting better. The warming climate meant longer growing seasons for plants, more productive environments in regions that had been marginal during the coldest periods. New territories opening up as ice retreated, creating opportunities for expansion and exploration. For 1,000 years, from roughly 15,000 to 14,000 years ago, this was the pattern. Gradual warming, ice sheets retreating, sea levels rising, but slowly, predictably. Humans adapting, migrating, adjusting their lifestyles to match the changing environment. Some groups flourished in the new conditions, others struggled, but nobody faced extinction. Nobody felt like they were witnessing the end of the world. That was the cruelest part looking back. The false hope. The sense that yes, things were changing, but humans had always adapted to change. We'd survived the Ice Age. We'd spread across the entire planet from tropical Africa to frozen Siberia. We'd learned to thrive in every environment Earth could throw at us. This was just another challenge, another adjustment. We'd figure it out. But the planet wasn't done with gradual change. Behind the scenes, in ways nobody could see or predict, the climate system was becoming unstable. The ice sheets were melting, yes, but they were also storing enormous amounts of meltwater in their interiors, in channels and pockets where friction and pressure created liquid water, even in sub-freezing surface conditions. The ice-dammed lakes were filling, holding more water than the ice structures were designed to contain. The ocean circulation patterns that moderate global climate were straining under the influx of fresh water from melting glaciers. The system was loading, pressure building. And around 12,900 years ago, something pushed it over the edge. The gradual warming that had persisted for over 1,000 years, that had seemed manageable, that had given humans hope they could adapt their way through this, it suddenly stopped and reversed. Within a span of years, maybe decades, the climate didn't just cool, it plunged. The northern hemisphere went back into the freezer in the most dramatic climate shift in recent geological history. And when that happened, when the Younger Dryas cold period began, it set in motion a cascade of events that would eventually lead to the catastrophic floods, the drowning of the ancient world, and the permanent transformation of human civilization. But nobody saw it coming. How could they? The world had been warming for 1,000 years. Everyone alive had grown up with the expectation that this was the new pattern, that the Ice Age was truly ending, that the future would be warmer, more hospitable, easier. They were wrong, and what came next would prove that the planet's climate wasn't gradually transitioning to a new stable state. It was balanced on a knife edge, about to tip into catastrophe. 12,900 years ago, in what must have seemed like the cruelest twist of fate imaginable, the warming stopped. Not gradually, not with warning signs that gave people time to prepare. It just stopped, like someone flipped a switch on the entire planet's climate system. And then, within what geological evidence suggests might have been as little as a decade, maybe even less, temperatures plummeted. Imagine you're living through that transition. You're part of a community that's been adjusting to warmer conditions for your entire life. Your parents and grandparents told stories about the old cold times, when winters were brutal and long, when ice covered landscapes that are green now. But that was before. That was the past. Your world has been warming for as long as anyone can remember. The springs come earlier. The summers are longer. Plants that used to grow only in the south are common here now. Your people have adapted. You've changed your hunting strategies, your seasonal movements, your whole way of life to match the new climate. Then one year, the summer doesn't quite arrive the way it should. It's cooler than normal. The plants don't grow as vigorously. The harvest of berries and nuts is poor. Maybe it's just a bad year, you think. Weather varies. Next year will be better, but next year is worse, and the year after that is worse still. Within a decade, maybe within just a few years, you're living in conditions your grandparents would recognize from their childhood stories. The brutal cold has returned. The Ice Age hasn't ended. It came back. The temperature drop was staggering. In some regions of the Northern Hemisphere, average temperatures fell by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. 15 degrees! That's the difference between a temperate climate and an Arctic one. That's the difference between forests and tundra, between abundant life and barren survival. And it happened so fast that ecosystems couldn't adapt, couldn't adjust. Species that had been expanding their ranges northward suddenly found themselves in conditions they weren't equipped for. Plants that had colonized newly warmed regions died back. Animals that had migrated north retreated or died. For humans, the impact was catastrophic. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic event, but through the slow, grinding pressure of winters that lasted most of the year, summers too short to grow enough food, game animals that became scarce or disappeared entirely. The populations that had been growing, spreading, taking advantage of the warmer conditions, they suddenly faced resource scarcity on a scale nobody alive had experienced. Scientists call this cold period the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower called Dryas octopetala that suddenly reappears in European pollen records from this time. The flower is a tundra specialist, a plant that thrives in cold, harsh conditions and hadn't been common in Europe for thousands of years during the warming period. Its sudden return is like a message written in fossilized pollen. The cold came back, the tundra returned. The Ice Age conditions that everyone thought were gone forever, they weren't gone, they were just taking a breath. The Younger Dryas lasted for 1,300 years. 1,300 years of cold interrupting the warming trend that should have continued. That's not a blip. That's not a minor fluctuation. That's long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall, long enough for multiple human generations to be born, live their entire lives, and die never knowing anything but cold. Long enough that the memory of the warmer times before would have faded into legend, into stories the elders told that might have seemed like fantasy to young people who'd never experienced anything but harsh winters and short summers. But what caused it? How do you suddenly freeze a planet that's in the middle of warming up? The sun's output doesn't change that fast. The Earth's orbital cycles that trigger ice ages, they operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years, not decades. So what happened? What could possibly cause such a dramatic, sudden reversal in global climate? The answer, most scientists now believe, lies in the ocean, specifically in the Atlantic Ocean circulation system. There's a vast conveyor belt of water movement in the Atlantic, technically called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, though most people know it by the name of one of its components, the Gulf Stream. Here's how it works. Warm, salty water from the tropics flows north along the surface of the Atlantic. As it reaches the North Atlantic, near Greenland and Iceland, it cools. Cold water is denser than warm water. Salty water is denser than fresh water. So this cold, salty water becomes heavy enough that it sinks, descending to the deep ocean, and then flows south along the ocean floor back toward the equator. This creates a continuous circulation, a conveyor belt that transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the high latitudes of the North Atlantic. This circulation system is why Europe is so much warmer than other places at the same latitude. Without the Gulf Stream and the larger circulation pattern it's part of, London would have the climate of northern Canada. Paris would be as cold as Winnipeg. The warm water flowing north keeps the entire region temperate despite being so far north. But this circulation system has a weakness, a vulnerability built into its mechanics. It depends on density differences. The water has to be cold enough and salty enough to sink. If you disrupt that density balance, if you suddenly dump massive amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic, you can shut the system down. And that's apparently what happened. Around 12,900 years ago, one or more of the ice dams holding back glacial lakes failed. Catastrophically, billions of gallons of fresh water, meltwater that had been accumulating behind ice barriers for centuries, suddenly burst through and flooded into the North Atlantic. This wasn't a normal river flood. This was a volume of fresh water large enough to change the salinity of the entire North Atlantic surface layer. And fresh water, being less dense than salt water, floats. It forms a layer on top of the ocean surface that prevents the normal sinking process that drives the circulation. The conveyor belt stopped. The flow of warm water from the tropics to the high latitudes shut down. And without that heat transport, the entire northern hemisphere, especially the regions around the North Atlantic, got much, much colder. The same mechanism that had been keeping Europe relatively mild suddenly wasn't functioning. The heat that should have been warming the high latitudes was staying in the tropics, and the cold that naturally exists in the polar regions, it had nothing to moderate it. The evidence for this massive freshwater pulse is written in ocean sediment cores from the North Atlantic. There's a distinct layer, dating to exactly 12,900 years ago, where the chemistry changes dramatically. The isotopic ratios in fossilized shells of microscopic organisms show a sudden influx of fresh water. The sediment composition changes in ways that match glacial meltwater from North America. The timing lines up perfectly with the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling. It's not speculation, it's not theory, it's direct physical evidence of catastrophic freshwater flooding into the North Atlantic at exactly the moment the climate shut down. Which lake failed? Probably Lake Agassiz, that massive body of water forming behind ice dams in central Canada. But it might have been multiple lakes draining simultaneously, or in rapid succession. The exact mechanism is still debated. What's not debated is that it happened. Enormous quantities of fresh water entered the North Atlantic, the circulation system shut down, and the climate responded by plunging back into near-ice age conditions almost overnight. For the people living through this, the mechanism didn't matter. What mattered was the reality. The world they'd been adapting to, the warmer world that had seemed like the new normal, it was gone, replaced by cold that just kept coming. Winter after winter, each one brutal, each one longer than it should be. Summers that barely qualified as spring. Growing seasons too short for plants that had been reliable food sources, game animals migrating away from regions that had supported them during the warming period. The archaeological record from this time is grim. In many regions, you see evidence of human populations crashing. Settlements that were occupied during the warming period before the Younger Dryas, they're abandoned during the cold snap. Sites that show evidence of substantial populations before 12,900 years ago become empty or show signs of much smaller groups afterward. Human remains from this period sometimes show skeletal markers of nutritional stress, evidence that people weren't getting enough food, weren't growing to their full potential, or experiencing periods of near starvation. Some populations disappeared entirely. The Clovis culture in North America, identifiable by their distinctive spear points and tool technologies, they flourished before the Younger Dryas. They were widespread, successful, spreading across large portions of North America. Then, right around the time the Younger Dryas began, the Clovis culture vanishes from the archaeological record. Their distinctive tools stop appearing. Their sites stop being occupied. What happened to them? Did they die out? Did they transform into something else? Did climate change destroy the way of life that had made them successful? We don't know. But the timing is suspicious. The correlation between the climate catastrophe and their disappearance is hard to ignore. The megafauna suffered too. Animals that were already under pressure from the earlier warming, that were already seeing their populations decline, they got hit with another massive stress. The Younger Dryas cold meant their food sources changed again, just as they were adapting to the previous changes. Mammoths in particular were devastated. Populations that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly collapsed. By the end of the Younger Dryas, mammoths had vanished from large parts of their former range. Other species went extinct entirely during this period. The combination of rapid climate change whiplash and human hunting pressure was too much. They couldn't adapt fast enough. But here's the thing about the Younger Dryas that makes it particularly important for our story. It didn't just make things cold again. It didn't just reverse the warming and put humanity and ecosystems back under Ice Age pressure. It created what you might call a pressure cooker effect. Because even though surface temperatures dropped, even though the climate went back into the freezer, the underlying forces that had been warming the planet didn't stop. The Earth's orbital position relative to the Sun, the Milankovitch cycles that control long-term climate patterns, they were still pointing toward warming. The Northern Hemisphere was still receiving more solar radiation during summer than it had during the glacial maximum. This meant that even during the Younger Dryas cold period, ice was still melting. Not as fast as during the warming period before, but still melting. Glaciers that had started retreating before the cold snap, they stopped retreating, but they didn't necessarily advance back to their previous maximum extents. They stabilized, found a balance between the cold temperatures trying to make them grow and the underlying warming trend trying to make them shrink. And that meant meltwater was still being produced, still flowing off the ice sheets, still accumulating in low areas, still needing somewhere to go. The ice dams that had weakened during the warming period, that had been on the verge of failing before the Younger Dryas began, they got a reprieve. The cold strengthened them, reinforced them with new ice, made them stable again, but they were still damaged, still structurally compromised from the previous stress, and now they were holding back more water than before, because the lakes behind them were still filling, still accumulating meltwater, growing larger and deeper even though the climate had cooled. Lake Agassiz, which had partially drained when its ice dam failed at the start of the Younger Dryas, it refilled during the cold period. Fed by runoff from the surrounding ice sheets, by meltwater from the Laurentide ice sheet that still covered much of Canada even during the cold snap, the lake grew to unprecedented size. At its maximum extent during the Younger Dryas, Lake Agassiz might have been larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, containing enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters if it all drained at once. And it was all held in place by ice dams that were stronger than they'd been 1,000 years earlier, but under more pressure than they'd ever been designed to withstand. The same pattern repeated at smaller scales all around the northern hemisphere. Glacial lakes filling behind ice dams, water accumulating, pressure building. The ice structures holding, reinforced by cold temperatures, but increasingly strained. The Younger Dryas had essentially reset the melting process, but it hadn't eliminated the underlying instability. It had just delayed the catastrophe, given the ice dams a temporary reprieve while making the eventual failure even more devastating because there was now more water to release. For 1,300 years this pressure built. Ice sheets that should have been collapsing under warming conditions instead maintained massive volumes of ice, while becoming internally unstable. The bases of the ice sheets, where pressure and friction create heat even in sub-freezing surface conditions, were saturated with meltwater. Channels carved into the ice from below, creating networks of weakness. The ice was still thick, still massive, still imposing from the outside, but internally it was compromised, riddled with meltwater passages, structurally unsound, waiting for the trigger that would cause total collapse, and humans living near these glacial features had no idea what was coming. How could they? The ice seemed eternal. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, through the warming period, through the cold snap, always present, always massive, always apparently permanent. The idea that it could suddenly fail, that millions of tons of ice could transform into billions of gallons of flowing water in a matter of days or weeks, it wasn't something you'd predict. It wasn't something you'd prepare for. The Younger Dryas was, in many ways, the cruelest period. Cruel because it gave false hope during the earlier warming, making people think the Ice Age was truly ending, letting them adapt to a warmer world. Then cruel again because it ripped that away, plunged them back into cold they thought was gone forever, forced them to survive conditions their grandparents had barely survived themselves. And cruel a final time because it was building toward an even greater catastrophe that nobody could see coming. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended. The reasons are still debated, but the most likely explanation is that the freshwater pulse that had shut down the Atlantic circulation finally dispersed. Either it mixed with salt water enough that density gradients could re-establish, or it spread thin enough that salty water could sink again in other locations. Whatever the mechanism, the circulation system restarted. Heat began flowing north from the tropics again, and the climate responded even faster than it had when the cooling began. The warming at the end of the Younger Dryas was the most dramatic climate shift in recent geological history. Some regions saw temperature increases of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. Ice cores from Greenland show the transition as a sharp line, not a gradual change. 1 year, Ice Age conditions. 10 years later, modern climate. The world transformed with shocking speed. And all those ice dams that had been reinforced during the cold period, all those glacial lakes that had filled to maximum capacity, all that stored water that had been building pressure for over 1,000 years, it all let go at once. The sudden warming destabilized ice structures that had seemed solid. The temperature increase was so fast, so dramatic, that the ice couldn't adjust. It just failed, catastrophically. All across the northern hemisphere, ice dams that had held for centuries suddenly breached. The great unleashing was about to begin. The floods that would reshape continents, drown the ancient world, and force humanity to become something different were no longer building. They were happening, and nothing in the human world would ever be the same. Then it happened. Around 11,700 years ago, the warming that had paused for over a millennium suddenly resumed. But this wasn't the gradual, manageable warming of the earlier period. This was something different, something unprecedented. The climate didn't ease into warmer conditions, it lurched. Within what ice core records suggest might have been less than a decade, possibly as little as 3 years in some regions, temperatures in the northern hemisphere shot up by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. 10 to 15 degrees in 3 years. That's not climate change as we normally conceive it. That's a climate emergency. Imagine you're living through that transition. You've spent your entire life in Younger Dryas conditions. Your parents lived through it. Your grandparents adapted to it. The brutal cold, the short summers, the long winters, that's just how the world is. That's normal. You've developed survival strategies, clothing technologies, hunting techniques, all optimized for Ice Age conditions. Your whole culture is built around the cold. Then one spring the melt comes early, really early, and it doesn't stop. The snow that usually lingers in shaded areas through most of the summer, it's gone by late spring. Rivers that normally run cold with glacial meltwater, they're warm enough to wade in comfortably. Plants you've never seen before are sprouting everywhere. Animals you've only heard about in old stories, species that had retreated south during the cold snap, they're suddenly showing up in your hunting territories. Within a few years, the entire character of your world has transformed. The ice age your grandparents barely survived, it's just gone. Vanished like it was never there. For the ecosystems, this was whiplash. Species that had adapted to cold were suddenly in an environment they weren't equipped for. Animals with thick fur coats found themselves overheating. Plants that required cold winters to germinate properly stopped reproducing. The tundra that had spread south during the Younger Dryas began dying back as forests colonized from the south, moving north at rates that would seem impossible if we didn't have the pollen evidence showing exactly how fast it happened. In some regions, forests advanced northward at a rate of 1 kilometre per year. You could literally watch the tree line moving if you paid attention over the course of your lifetime. But the most dramatic response came from the ice. Those massive ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe, the ones that had been stable during the Younger Dryas cold period, they suddenly found themselves in temperatures far above anything they were adapted to. Summer temperatures that used to hover around freezing were now reaching 10, 15, 20 degrees Celsius. The ice didn't just melt slowly from the edges, it began failing structurally. The ice dams holding back glacial lakes, the structures that had been reinforced during the cold period but were still fundamentally compromised from earlier stresses, they couldn't handle the sudden temperature spike. Ice that had seemed solid, eternal, permanent, began weakening. Cracks formed. Water that had been frozen within the ice structure began flowing. The dams didn't slowly erode, they catastrophically failed. The largest documented failure was Lake Agassiz. Remember, this was a lake larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, containing enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters. For over 1,000 years during the Younger Dryas, it had been filling, growing, accumulating meltwater behind ice dams that stretched for hundreds of miles. Those dams were hundreds of feet thick, massive walls of ice that seemed as permanent as mountains. But ice has a fundamental weakness. It melts. And when the warming hit, when temperatures spiked so dramatically, the ice dams didn't just weaken, they collapsed. Picture what that failure looked like. You're living maybe 100 miles downstream from Lake Agassiz, though you don't know the lake exists. It's hidden behind ice, beyond the glacial margin, in territory nobody has explored. You're in a river valley, a good valley, with reliable water and decent hunting. Your family has been here for several generations. This is home. Then one day, maybe in early summer when meltwater is already running high, you hear something. A distant rumbling, like thunder but continuous. It doesn't stop. It gets louder. The ground starts to shake. Not violently, not like an earthquake, but a persistent trembling you can feel through your feet. The river in front of you, the river that's been a constant presence your entire life, it suddenly changes. The water level rises. Fast. Too fast. This isn't normal spring flooding. This is something else. The water turns muddy, filled with sediment, carrying debris that shouldn't be there. Trees still rooted in the ground, floating past. Massive chunks of ice, some of them the size of houses spinning in the current. And the water keeps rising. Within hours, the river has become unrecognizable. It's not a river anymore. It's a moving lake, spreading across the valley floor, climbing the banks, reaching for the higher ground where your camp sits. You run. Your family runs. You grab what you can carry, the essential tools, the irreplaceable items, and you head for the hills. Behind you, the water consumes everything. Your camp, your food stores, your accumulated possessions, all of it swept away. And you're the lucky ones. You had time to run. You were far enough from the main flood path that you could reach high ground. Closer to the ice dam, in the direct path of the initial surge, there was no warning, no time to react. The wall of water, hundreds of feet high in some places, moving at speeds approaching 80 miles per hour, carrying millions of tons of ice and rock and debris, it simply erased everything in its path. This wasn't like a river flood that comes and then recedes. This was the catastrophic release of a lake the size of a small sea. The initial surge might have taken days to pass. Days of continuous flow, billions of gallons per second, carving channels through solid bedrock, stripping away hundreds of feet of soil and sediment, creating new valleys, destroying old ones, fundamentally reshaping the landscape. The Missoula floods, what geologists call the series of catastrophic outbursts from glacial lakes in the Pacific Northwest, left scars on the landscape that are still visible today. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington state, if you fly over them, look like something from another planet. Massive channels carved into basalt bedrock, giant ripples in the landscape, each one 40 to 50 feet high and hundreds of feet apart, created by floodwaters carrying boulders and sediment in waves that dwarfed any tsunami in recorded history. Islands of harder rock standing alone in the middle of dry valleys, places where the flood couldn't quite scour away the most resistant formations. One of the most dramatic features is a place called Dry Falls. It's a cliff face 3.5 miles wide and 400 feet high. Today it's completely dry, just a horseshoe-shaped escarpment in the middle of relatively flat terrain. But during the floods, water was pouring over that cliff at rates estimated at 10 times the combined flow of every river on Earth today. 10 times! Try to picture that. The roar would have been audible for hundreds of miles. The mist and spray thrown up by that much falling water would have created permanent clouds, rainbows visible from enormous distances, fog that would have obscured the sun for anyone nearby. And this didn't happen just once. The evidence suggests Lake Missoula filled and drained catastrophically dozens of times over several thousand years. Each time the lake filled behind ice dams that reformed as the glacier advanced and retreated. Each time it reached a critical threshold and broke through, sending another massive flood down the same channels, scouring them deeper, making them wider, adding another layer to the geological violence. But Lake Missoula was just one lake. Lake Agassiz was much larger, and it had multiple drainage routes. When its southern ice dam failed, water flooded south down the Mississippi River Valley. When the eastern dam failed, water burst through toward the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. When the northern dam failed, water poured into Hudson Bay, and from there into the North Atlantic. Each failure was a continent-scale catastrophe. Each one released enough water to raise global sea levels by measurable amounts. Each one carved new river valleys, created temporary seas, deposited sediment layers that are still identifiable in the geological record. The cascade effect was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. One dam failure could trigger others. The flood from Lake Agassiz would undermine ice dams downstream, causing them to fail, releasing even more water, or the sudden drainage of one lake would change the stress patterns on nearby ice structures, causing them to collapse days or weeks later. The floods fed on themselves, creating a domino effect of catastrophic releases across the entire northern hemisphere. Europe experienced similar events as the Fennoscandian ice sheet retreated. Glacial lakes in what's now the Baltic region, in Russia, in Siberia, they all drained catastrophically at various points during this period. The Baltic Sea basin itself was repeatedly filled and drained as ice dams formed and failed, creating a complex history of freshwater lakes and saltwater intrusions that geologists are still piecing together. In Asia, massive glacial outburst floods from lakes in the Altai Mountains carved valleys and deposited enormous gravel bars that dwarf anything created by normal river flooding. The Himalayas experienced their own megafloods as glacial lakes trapped in mountain valleys broke through their ice or moraine dams. Each event was locally catastrophic, destroying anything in the flood path, reshaping valleys that had been stable for millennia. The human casualties must have been enormous, though we have no way to quantify them. No written records, no mass graves identifiable as flood victims. The floods themselves would have destroyed most evidence of the people they killed. Bodies carried miles downstream, buried under tons of sediment, or simply swept into the ocean where they decompose and leave no trace. But logic dictates that thousands, possibly tens of thousands of people died in these floods. Populations living in river valleys, taking advantage of reliable water sources and good hunting, they were exactly in the path of the catastrophic drainages. Some might have had warning. That distant rumbling, the ground shaking, may be strange behaviour from animals sensitive to seismic activity or changes in air pressure. But warning of what? If you'd never experienced a flood of this magnitude, never even heard stories about something comparable, how would you interpret the signs? Would you know to run? Would you know which direction was safe? Or would you stand there, confused, trying to understand what was happening until it was too late? Others had no warning at all. The floods moved fast, especially in the initial surges when ice dams first failed. A wall of water appearing without preamble, moving faster than you could run, carrying enough mass to obliterate anything in its path. Death would have been instantaneous for anyone caught directly in the flow. Not drowning, not swept away, just instantly crushed by the sheer force of billions of gallons of water moving at highway speeds. And even for those who survived the initial flood, the aftermath would have been devastating. Your territory, your hunting grounds, your familiar landscape, all of it transformed beyond recognition. The valley you knew scoured down to bedrock, the forest where you gathered food stripped away, the river that provided fish, now a raging torrent carrying ice and debris too dangerous to approach, the landmarks you used for navigation buried under sediment or carried away entirely. Even if you survived, even if you reached high ground, you'd be left in an alien landscape where all your accumulated knowledge about local resources, about seasonal patterns, about where to find food and water, suddenly became useless. The floods also had immediate effects on ocean circulation. All that fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic, it disrupted the circulation patterns that were just recovering from the Younger Dryas shutdown. Some researchers think the massive drainage events might have caused short-term cooling events, mini-climate disruptions that lasted decades or centuries as the ocean circulation adjusted to the enormous freshwater inputs. The climate system was reeling, trying to find a new equilibrium, getting massive shocks of fresh water that kept disrupting the process. But here's what's important to understand. These floods, as catastrophic as they weren't the worst of what was coming. They were the immediate crisis, the dramatic events that killed people and reshaped landscapes in days or weeks. But there was a longer, slower catastrophe unfolding simultaneously. Because all that water from the failed ice dams, all those billions of gallons flooding from glacial lakes, it was all heading toward the ocean. And when it got there, when it mixed with the seawater and spread across the global ocean system, it raised the sea level. Permanently, irreversibly. And that sea level rise, that 400 feet of vertical change spread over several thousand years, that was the catastrophe that would truly reshape the world. That was the flood humanity would never recover from. The ice dams failures were dramatic. They were violent. They were immediately deadly to anyone unlucky enough to be in their path, but they were over quickly. Days, weeks, maybe months for the largest events. Then the water drained away, leaving scarred landscapes but also leaving land. The valleys might be destroyed, but they were still above water, still potentially habitable once the immediate danger passed. The sea level rise was different. That wasn't temporary. That didn't drain away. The water that reached the ocean, it stayed there. And as more ice melted, as more glacial lakes drained, as the warming continued and the ice sheets began their final collapse, the ocean just kept rising, slowly, inexorably, without pause, without mercy, swallowing coastlines that had been home to human populations for thousands of years, drowning the ancient world 1 mile at a time, 1 generation at a time, until everything that had been built on those fertile coastal plains was buried under hundreds of feet of seawater. The mega-floods were the spectacular catastrophe. The drowning of the world was the permanent one. And that story, that slow-motion apocalypse, it was just beginning. The catastrophic floods from breaking ice dams were over relatively quickly. Days, weeks, maybe a few months for the largest events. Terrifying, deadly, landscape-altering, but temporary. The water surged through, carved its channels and drained away. Within a generation, maybe 2, the scars would begin to heal. Vegetation would return to the scoured valleys. Animals would repopulate the devastated territories. Humans could move back cautiously, learning to avoid the obvious flood paths, building on higher ground, adapting. But all that water, those billions upon billions of gallons that had been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years, it didn't disappear. It went into the ocean, and once it was there, once it mixed with the salt water and spread across the global ocean basins, it stayed. The sea level began to rise. Not in one dramatic surge, but relentlessly, continuously, without pause or mercy, for thousands of years. 400 feet. That's how much the oceans rose, between roughly 15,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago. 400 feet of vertical sea level change. To put that in perspective, that's taller than a 30-story building. Imagine standing on a beach and knowing that eventually, inevitably, the water will rise high enough to submerge everything for miles inland. Every coastal plain, every river valley, every landscape where humans had built lives for thousands of years, all of it destined to drown. The cruelest part about this catastrophe wasn't its speed, it was its slowness. 400 feet over 8,000 years averages to about 6 inches per decade, half a foot every 10 years. That's barely noticeable in a human lifetime. Your grandfather might remember the beach being slightly farther out when he was young. You might notice that the tidal flats where you collected shellfish as a child are underwater more often now. Your children might see the fishing camp your family has used for generations finally get claimed by storms that push water farther inland than before. Each generation adapts to its new normal, watching a bit more land disappear, adjusting their lives to accommodate the advancing sea. But it adds up. 6 inches per decade is 5 feet per century, 50 feet per millennium, and it doesn't stop. It just keeps coming, generation after generation, century after century, until landscapes that seemed eternal are completely erased. And here's the thing that makes it truly horrifying. The rate wasn't constant. Sea level rise came in pulses. Sometimes the water advanced slowly, predictably, giving people time to adjust. Then an ice dam would fail or a section of ice sheet would collapse and you'd get a surge, 10 feet in a few decades, 20 feet in a century. Fast enough that you could watch coastlines retreating in real time. Fast enough that villages would be abandoned within a single generation because the sea simply took them. Let's talk about Doggerland, that massive plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. 20,000 years ago, it was a country unto itself. Rolling hills, river valleys, forests and grasslands stretching for hundreds of miles. Archaeological evidence, the fragmentary bits we've recovered from fishing trawlers that accidentally dredge up artifacts, suggest Doggerland was heavily populated during the Ice Age. Why wouldn't it be? It was prime territory, moderate climate, abundant resources, rivers flowing from the highlands to the north and south, creating diverse habitats, coastal access to marine resources. This wasn't marginal land. This was the heartland of late Ice Age Europe. Picture yourself living in Doggerland around 12,000 years ago, right as the Younger Dryas is ending and the serious warming is beginning. You're part of a community that's been here for generations, maybe centuries. Your people know this land intimately. Every river, every hill, every grove of trees, every seasonal pattern. You know, where the deer migrate in autumn. You know which valleys have the best hazelnuts. You know where salmon run in the rivers each spring. This is home, not just in the emotional sense, but in the deep ancestral sense of belonging to a place that's shaped your culture's entire existence. The coastline is several days' walk to the west. The actual ocean, the deep water, it's distant, remote. You're aware of it, sure. Some families make seasonal trips to collect shellfish or hunt seals, but it's not a daily presence. It's not something you think about much. The Thames River, which will one day flow through London into the North Sea, right now it's a tributary of a much larger river system that flows north across Doggerland before reaching the Atlantic somewhere far beyond where the modern coastline sits. Then, slowly, things begin to change. The families who make those seasonal trips to the coast start reporting that the journey is shorter than it used to be. Not dramatically shorter, not alarmingly so, but noticeable. The coastline has moved inland, maybe a mile, maybe a few miles. The elders discuss it around fires. Some remember their grandparents mentioning something similar decades ago, a time when the sea was advancing, though it stopped and stabilized before becoming a real problem. Decades pass. The trend continues. The coast is definitely closer now. River valleys in the low-lying areas are becoming tidal. Salt water is pushing upstream during high tides, contaminating freshwater sources. Marshlands are forming where there used to be dry ground. Families living in the lowest areas are moving to higher ground, complaining that their traditional camps are flooded too often to be viable anymore. But it's manageable. It's an inconvenience, not a crisis. People adapt. They move their settlements back from the water. They adjust their resource extraction strategies. They cope. A century passes, then 2, then 5. Each generation notices the water is closer than it was when their parents were young. The great central river of Doggerland, the one that drained so much of the interior, it's becoming an estuary. Salt water is flowing dozens of miles inland. The fish populations are changing. Freshwater species are being replaced by marine ones. The character of the land itself is transforming from terrestrial to transitional to aquatic. The hills, the high points in Doggerland's landscape, they're becoming islands. Not suddenly, not overnight, but over generations. First, they're cut off during high tides, reconnecting to the mainland when the water recedes. Then they're only reachable by boat most of the time, with narrow causeways that briefly emerge at the lowest tides. Then they're permanent islands surrounded by water, their connection to the mainland now just a memory in the stories of elderly people who remember when you could walk across. By 10,000 years ago, Doggerland is no longer a continuous landmass. It's fragmenting. An archipelago of islands in a shallow sea that's still rising. The remaining populations are concentrated on the higher ground, watching as the territory their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years disappears beneath the waves. Some families decide to leave, to migrate east toward what will become the Netherlands and Germany, or west toward what's becoming the British Isles. Others stay, clinging to the remaining islands, hoping the water will stop rising, hoping this is as bad as it gets. It isn't. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, probably triggered by an earthquake as the Earth's crust rebounded from the weight of melted ice, generated a tsunami. The Storegga Slide, geologists call it. It displaced roughly 800 cubic kilometres of seafloor sediment, sending waves up to 80 feet high racing across the North Sea. For the remaining communities in Doggerland, communities already living on islands barely above sea level, the tsunami was an extinction event. The waves swept over the low-lying islands, destroying everything, drowning populations that had stubbornly remained. Within hours, the last remnants of Doggerland were either underwater or scoured clean of human presence. Within a few more centuries, even the highest points were submerged. Doggerland was gone, completely. A country that had existed for tens of thousands of years, that had been home to countless human generations, simply ceased to exist. Britain became an island, permanently separated from Europe. The North Sea was born, and everything that had been Doggerland, all the settlements and burial grounds and sacred sites and accumulated history, all of it was buried under hundreds of feet of salt water and marine sediment. Erased. The same pattern repeated on the other side of the world. Sunderland, that massive tropical landmass connecting Southeast Asia, it drowned even more dramatically than Doggerland because it was lower lying, more vulnerable to sea level rise. Imagine living in Sunderland around 15,000 years ago. You're in a tropical paradise. Vast forests teeming with life, rivers draining from the highlands, creating fertile valleys. Coastlines, yes, but distant, not immediately threatening. The interior of Sunderland is hundreds of miles across. The idea that the ocean could ever reach this far inland would seem absurd, but the water comes, slowly. The southern coast begins retreating first. Families living near the actual pre-flood coastline are the first to notice. The beaches they've always known are shrinking. The river mouths are becoming bays. Marshlands are forming along the coast, replacing forests with brackish swamps where mangroves begin taking over. It's strange, unsettling, but not immediately catastrophic. Centuries pass, the fragmentation begins. Sunderland starts breaking into pieces. The South China Sea begins to form, not as a sudden inundation, but as a gradual encroachment. Water pushing inland along river valleys, creating channels, widening those channels into straits, isolating higher ground into islands. The island of Borneo, it wasn't always an island. It was a highland in Sunderland's interior. Same with Sumatra, with Java, with dozens of smaller islands in the Indonesian archipelago. They were all connected, all part of the same landmass. The ocean separated them, divided what had been continuous populations into isolated island communities. And this happened within the span of human memory, or at least within the span of cultural memory passed down through generations. Aboriginal peoples in Southeast Asia, their oral traditions contain references to lands that are now underwater, to connections between islands that no longer exist. These aren't vague mythological concepts. They're specific geographical memories preserved for thousands of years, memories of when you could walk from place to place that now require boats and ocean navigation. The psychological impact of watching your world drown over generations must have been profound. Imagine the conversations around fires, elders telling young people about lands that used to exist, territories their grandparents had hunted but that were now beneath the sea. Imagine the sense of loss, the understanding that the world was permanently changing, that the geography your ancestors had known was being erased. And imagine the fear, because if the water had risen this much already, who's to say it would stop? What if it just kept coming until there was no land left at all? The Persian Gulf filled during this period too. During the Ice Age, it didn't exist as a body of water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed south through a valley where the Gulf is now, joining with other rivers from the Arabian highlands, creating one massive river system that continued south toward the ocean, which was much farther away. That valley was fertile, well-watered, perfect for human habitation. We have every reason to believe substantial populations lived there, possibly even developing early agricultural practices in an environment that was ideal for such experimentation. Then the sea level rose. The Gulf began to fill. Unlike Doggerland or Sunderland, which drowned relatively slowly, the Persian Gulf might have filled quite rapidly. The topography was such that once sea levels rose high enough, water could pour in relatively quickly, flooding the entire basin within centuries rather than millennia. For anyone living in that valley, the change would have been dramatic. Within a few generations, their entire homeland was underwater, replaced by a shallow sea. Some researchers think this catastrophic flooding of the Persian Gulf might be the source of Mesopotamian flood myths. The Sumerians, developing their civilization in the river valleys just north of the Gulf, they might have been descendants of peoples displaced from the drowned valley. Their stories of a great flood of Utnapishtim surviving the deluge that destroyed the world might be cultural memories of watching their ancestral homeland disappear beneath rising seas. Not all at once, not in 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but in a process fast enough that elders could remember when the land existed, and young people grew up knowing only the sea. The Black Sea flood is perhaps the most dramatic single flooding event during this period. Today the Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow Bosporus Strait. But during the Ice Age, and for several thousand years afterward, they weren't connected at all. The Black Sea was a giant freshwater lake, sitting about 500 feet lower than the Mediterranean, fed by rivers draining from Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Around its shores, human populations had settled. The lake provided fish, waterfowl, and a reliable water source in a region that was otherwise quite dry. Then, around 7,600 years ago, the sea level in the Mediterranean, swollen by thousands of years of ice melt, finally rose high enough to breach the natural barrier at the Bosporus. At first, it was probably just a trickle. Water from the Mediterranean finding a way through, a small stream flowing over the land bridge. But erosion works fast when you have the entire Mediterranean Sea pushing behind it. That trickle became a flow. The flow became a torrent. Within months, possibly weeks, the Mediterranean was pouring into the Black Sea basin at an estimated rate 200 times greater than Niagara Falls. 200 times Niagara. Try to comprehend that volume of water. The roar would have been audible from dozens of miles away. The spray and mist would have created permanent clouds above the strait. The ground would have shaken constantly from the sheer force of water carving through rock, and the Black Sea, that freshwater lake, was filling at a rate of roughly 6 inches per day. 6 inches every single day without stopping. Imagine you're living on the shores of the Black Sea when this happens. Your family has been here for generations. The lake level fluctuates slightly with the seasons, but it's been stable for as long as anyone can remember. Then one day, you notice the water level is higher than usual. Strange, but not alarming. Lakes have variations. But the next day it's higher still, and the day after that, higher again. Within a week it's clear something unprecedented is happening. The water is rising steadily, continuously, claiming more shoreline every single day. You move your camp back from the water, then you move it again, and again. You're retreating inland, but the water keeps following. Within a month, the fishing grounds you've always used are too deep to reach. The beaches where you collected shellfish are under 10 feet of water. The landmarks you used for navigation are submerged, and there's no sign it's stopping. The entire community is in motion, constantly, retreating, watching their world disappear beneath an advancing flood that shows no mercy. Within a year, maybe less, the entire character of the Black Sea is transformed. The freshwater lake is now a saltwater sea, connected to the Mediterranean, still filling but approaching equilibrium with the global ocean level. Everything that lived in those waters before, the freshwater fish and plants, they're dying as the saltwater takes over, and the people who lived on those shores, they've been pushed inland, forced into territories that were already occupied, creating conflicts, disruptions, migrations that rippled across the entire region. Some researchers think refugees from the Black Sea flood carried their stories with them into Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant. That those stories, of a flood that came so fast you could watch it advance day by day, became the foundation for later flood myths. The Noah story, the Gilgamesh epic. Not metaphorical representations of divine judgment, but memories of real events, of watching the sea rise and drown an entire world within a single human lifetime. And here's what makes all of this truly haunting. This wasn't happening in one place. It was global. Every coastline on Earth was experiencing some version of this drowning. The coasts of Africa, Australia, the Americas, Europe, Asia, all of them retreating inland as the ocean advanced. Millions of people, maybe tens of millions by the end of the period, displaced from coastal territories, forced to migrate inland, to compete for resources with populations already there, to adapt to new environments and new ways of life. The refugees carried what they could, their technologies, their knowledge, their stories. But so much was left behind. Physical possessions too heavy to carry, sites too sacred to abandon but impossible to move. Burial grounds where ancestors had been laid to rest for generations, now underwater, lost forever. The accumulated cultural heritage of coastlines that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years, all of it drowned, scattered, destroyed by the advancing sea, and the sea level didn't rise uniformly. It came in pulses, in surges separated by periods of relative stability. You might go a century where the rise was slow enough to adapt to, where communities could adjust their territories gradually, where the change was manageable. Then an ice sheet would collapse, or a massive glacial lake would drain, and you'd get a pulse. 20 feet in a few decades. Enough to overwhelm any adaptation strategy, enough to force mass migrations, enough to destroy any illusion that humans could control or predict what was happening. By 7,000 years ago, the worst was over. The ice sheets had finished their major collapse. The glacial lakes were drained. Sea levels were approaching modern heights, still rising but much more slowly, in ways that were at least somewhat predictable. But the damage was done. The ancient world, the Ice Age, coastlines where human cultures had flourished for thousands of years, they were gone. 400 feet underwater, buried under marine sediment, transformed into the continental shelves we know today. And everything that had been built there, all the knowledge accumulated, all the innovations developed, all the societies created, it was lost. The people survived, yes, but the world they'd known, the landscapes that had shaped their cultures, the territories that had been home for countless generations, all of that was gone forever. Drowned beneath an ocean that had risen and never receded. Humanity would never get it back. We'd adapt to the new world, the post-flood world of higher seas and reduced coastlines. We'd build new societies, develop new technologies, create new cultures, but we'd do it as refugees, as survivors of the greatest environmental catastrophe our species had ever experienced, and we'd remember. Oh, we'd remember. The memory of the drowned world would echo through every culture, every civilization, every human society that came after. The story of how the waters rose and took everything, how the old world drowned, how we survived but never recovered, because the world we'd lost was simply gone, and nothing we built afterward could bring it back. But something extraordinary happened. Despite the catastrophe, despite the drowning of entire worlds, despite the loss of so much accumulated knowledge and territory, humanity didn't forget. We remembered. Not perfectly, not with the precision of written records or archaeological documentation, but we remembered in the way humans have always remembered important things, through stories, through myths passed down generation after generation, refined by thousands of retellings, encoded in narratives that became so sacred, so fundamental to cultural identity, that people fought to preserve them exactly as they'd received them. And here's what's remarkable. When you look at human cultures around the world, at societies separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, many of which had no contact with each other until recent centuries, you find over 200 different cultures that tell stories about a great flood. 200! Not similar stories that might have been influenced by contact or trade, independent traditions developed in isolation, telling essentially the same tale. water rising, the world drowning, nearly everyone dying except a chosen few, and those survivors starting over, rebuilding, becoming the ancestors of the people who now tell the story. This isn't coincidence. This isn't parallel mythology arising from similar psychological needs or shared symbolic frameworks. This is memory. Cultural memory of real events, preserved across hundreds of generations through the only medium available to proliterate peoples. Oral tradition, maintained with a fidelity that we're only now beginning to appreciate and verify through other methods. The oldest written version we have is from Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on clay tablets around 4,000 years ago. But the story itself is older, much older. The Sumerians were telling this tale at least 5,000 years ago, and the events it describes happened even earlier than that. In the epic, there's a character named Utnapishtim. He's essentially the Mesopotamian Noah, though his story predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The gods, in the Mesopotamian version, decide to destroy humanity with a catastrophic flood. The reasons vary depending on which version you read, but often it's because humans have become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive to the divine order. But one god, Ea, warns Utnapishtim. He tells him to tear down his house and build a boat. Not just any boat, but a massive vessel sealed with pitch and bitumen, large enough to hold his family, skilled craftspeople to preserve human knowledge, and representatives of every living creature. Sound familiar? The flood comes. It lasts for 6 days and 7 nights. The water rises until it covers everything, drowning the world. Mountains disappear beneath the waves. Everything dies except what's on the boat. Then the storm ends. The waters begin to recede. Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on a mountain. He sends out birds to search for dry land. First a dove, which returns finding nothing. Then a swallow, which also returns. Finally a raven, which doesn't come back, meaning it found land and stayed there. The flood is over. The world can begin again. The parallel to the biblical Noah story is obvious and not accidental. The Genesis account, written down perhaps 3,000 years ago, but based on older oral traditions, follows the same basic structure. Noah, the righteous man in a corrupt world. God decides to flood the earth. Noah receives instructions to build an ark, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Seal it with pitch. Bring your family and breeding pairs of every animal. Then comes the rain. 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rise for 150 days. Everything drowns except what's on the ark. Finally, the waters recede. The ark lands on Mount Ararat. Noah sends out a dove that returns with an olive branch, proving vegetation has returned, proving the land is recovering. God promises never to flood the world again. For thousands of years, people debated whether this was literal history or spiritual metaphor. But strip away the theological elements, the divine judgment, the moral lessons, and look at what remains. A description of catastrophic flooding, water rising high enough to cover known landscapes, a period of maximum inundation lasting for months, gradual recession as the waters drain or evaporate, mountains and high ground emerging first as the water level drops, the return of vegetation signalling recovery. This is exactly what you'd expect from someone describing rapid sea level rise at the end of the ice. Age? The rain might be the original storyteller's attempt to explain where all the water came from. They didn't have the concept of glaciers or ice sheets or melting ice caps. They just knew water fell from the sky. So a world-ending amount of water must have come from incredibly massive rainfall. Travel to India, and you find a completely different culture with a remarkably similar story. In Hindu tradition, there's a king named Manu who saves a small fish from being eaten by a larger one. The fish grows enormous, reveals itself as the god Vishnu, and warns Manu that a great deluge is coming. Manu builds a boat. When the flood arrives, the fish, now massive, tows the boat to safety on a mountain peak. After the flood, Manu becomes the father of a new humanity, repopulating the world. Different details, different gods, different cultural framework, but the same core elements. Catastrophic flood. Divine warning. One person builds a boat. Nearly everything dies. Survivors on a mountain. Humanity gets a fresh start. The story has been independently maintained in Hindu tradition for thousands of years, developing in isolation from Middle Eastern cultures until relatively recently in human history. In China, the flood narrative takes a different form but acknowledges the same fundamental crisis. The legend of Gun and his son Yu describes a time when catastrophic floods threaten to destroy civilization. Gun tries to stop the flooding by building dams, by containing the water through barriers and walls. He fails. The water is too powerful, too persistent. His son Yu succeeds by taking a different approach. Instead of trying to hold the water back, he dredges channels, creates irrigation systems, manages the flow rather than fighting it. He becomes Yu the Great, legendary founder of the Xia dynasty, celebrated for controlling the waters and making civilization possible. The Chinese version is interesting because it preserves a different detail. It's not just about surviving the flood, it's about the engineering response to it, the water management systems that had to be developed to allow human civilization to flourish after the catastrophe. This might reflect real historical responses in the Yellow River Valley, where rising sea levels and changing drainage patterns would have required exactly the kind of large-scale water management the legend describes. The story might be cultural memory of that critical adaptation period when humans had to learn to control water flow to survive in the post-flood world. The Greeks had their version. Zeus decides to destroy humanity because of their wickedness. He causes a catastrophic flood. Only Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha survive by building a chest, essentially a floating box, and climbing inside. They float for 9 days and nights. When the waters recede, they land on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders that transform into people. Again, the details are different, filtered through Greek mythology and cultural beliefs about gods and creation. But the framework is identical. Flood destroys the world. 2 survivors, boat or floating vessel, landing on a mountain, repopulation of the earth. The story is so similar to the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts that early Christian scholars assumed the Greeks must have borrowed it from Hebrew sources. But the Greek version predates any contact between those cultures, suggesting independent development from a common source, a shared memory of something that actually happened. Cross the ocean to the Americas, and the pattern continues. The Ojibwe people of North America tell of a time when the world was covered in water. Wissakedjak, a trickster hero, is floating on a raft with various animals. He sends animals diving down to find Earth. Muskrat succeeds, bringing up a small amount of mud from the bottom. Wissakedjak uses this mud to recreate the land, building the world anew from the remnants recovered from beneath the flood. The Aztecs believed the world had been destroyed and recreated multiple times. One of those destructions was by flood, a catastrophe that wiped out an entire world age before the current one began. The survivors had to start over, building a new civilization on the ruins of what had been drowned. In South America, the Mapuche people of Chile describe a battle between 2 serpents that caused the sea to overflow, drowning nearly everyone. Survivors fled to high mountains, waiting for the waters to recede. The Yanomami of the Amazon tell of a great flood that forced their ancestors to take refuge in caves in the highlands, emerging only after the waters had drained away. What's striking about the American flood myths is their geographic distribution. From the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin, from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America, indigenous peoples who had no contact with Middle Eastern or Asian cultures, who developed their traditions in complete isolation, they're telling versions of the same story. Water rising, world drowning, refuge on high ground, a few survivors, a new beginning. Perhaps the most remarkable flood traditions come from Aboriginal Australians. These aren't vague mythological accounts. They're specific, detailed, geographically precise descriptions of coastlines and islands that haven't existed for over 10,000 years. Stories passed down for more than 400 generations, maintaining accurate geographical information about landscapes that were drowned when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Aboriginal peoples along the Australian coast tell stories about islands that used to exist but are now underwater. About lands that connected places now separated by water. About specific geographical features, bays and headlands and river mouths, that don't match the current coastline but do match what the coastline looked like when sea levels were lower. Researchers have compared these oral traditions to geological and archaeological evidence, to sonar mapping of the seafloor, to reconstructions of ancient coastlines based on sea level data. And the Aboriginal stories are accurate. They're describing real places that really were above water 10,000 years ago, and really are underwater now. Think about what that means. cultural memory preserving detailed geographical information for 10,000 years, 400 generations of people telling these stories, maintaining them with enough fidelity that we can verify their accuracy today using scientific instruments and methods. If Aboriginal Australians can preserve accurate maps of drowned coastlines in oral tradition for 10,000 years, why couldn't Mesopotamians, Indians, Chinese and Native Americans preserve memories of catastrophic flooding that happened during the same period? The mechanism for this preservation is actually well understood by anthropologists who study oral traditions. Important information gets encoded in stories that are ritually repeated, often word for word, generation after generation. The stories become sacred, which means cultures develop strong mechanisms to ensure accurate transmission. Elders who can recite them perfectly hold positions of authority. Changes to the stories are discouraged or forbidden. Details get locked in through rhythm, repetition, association with important cultural practices like initiations or seasonal ceremonies. Over time, the context might be forgotten. People might not remember why a particular detail is important, but the detail itself survives because the story survives. The story becomes myth, becomes religion, becomes something people believe in without necessarily thinking it describes real historical events. But the memory remains, encoded in narratives that have been refined by thousands of retellings, preserved by cultures that understood, even if unconsciously, that these stories contained information too important to lose. And when you map flood myths against geological evidence of post-Ice Age flooding, you find correlations that are too consistent to be coincidental. Mesopotamian flood myths correspond to the flooding of the Persian Gulf and the inundation of river valleys when sea levels rose. The timing works, the geography works, the scale of the described flooding matches what we know happened in that region. Mediterranean flood myths align with the catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea, an event that happened around 7,600 years ago when rising sea levels caused the Mediterranean to breach a natural dam and pour into the Black Sea basin. That flood, geological evidence confirms, happened at exactly the speed and scale that local traditions describe. Water rising by inches per day, an entire lake transforming into a sea within a human lifetime, communities on the shores watching their world drown so fast they could measure the change from week to week. Native American flood myths from the Pacific Northwest describe waters rising and mountains appearing, consistent with the end of Ice Age conditions along the coast, where glacial melt and land subsidence dramatically altered the landscape. Chinese flood myths correspond to the period when the Yellow River Valley was subject to catastrophic flooding, as glacial meltwater changed drainage patterns and sea level rise pushed water up river valleys. This doesn't mean every detail of every flood myth is historically accurate. The gods, the moral lessons, the supernatural elements, these are cultural additions, interpretations, the framework each society used to make sense of the catastrophe. But the catastrophe itself appears to be real. The flooding happened, the world drowned, people survived and told their descendants what they'd witnessed, and those descendants told their descendants, and the story spread and changed and adapted to different languages and different cultures, but always keeping the same core truth. There was a time before when the world was different. Then came the waters. And when the waters receded, or more accurately when they stopped rising and found their new level, everything had changed. The old world was gone forever. The landscapes our ancestors had occupied for thousands of years, the coastal plains where populations had been densest and cultures most sophisticated, all of it was underwater. And the survivors, pushed inland, forced to adapt to new territories and new ways of life, they remembered. They told their children about the drowned lands, and their children told their children. And the memory persisted, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium. We're looking at humanity's collective memory of the end of the Ice Age, the period between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, when melting glaciers, collapsing ice dams, and rising sea levels created the most dramatic environmental changes human beings had ever experienced. For people living through it, it must have seemed like the end of the world. And in a sense, it was. The world they knew, the stable Ice Age geography that had persisted for tens of thousands of years, it was ending. Being replaced by something new, something warmer and wetter and fundamentally different. When we dismiss flood myths as primitive superstition or Bronze Age fantasy, we're ignoring 200 independent cultural testimonies about the same event. That's not how evidence works. When 200 witnesses all describe the same thing, you don't dismiss them. You start investigating what they saw. And what they saw, what they lived through, what they barely survived, was the greatest environmental catastrophe in human history since our species emerged. The flood that ended the Ice Age, the drowning of the ancient world, the event that forced humanity to either adapt or die. We adapted, we survived, and we remembered. For 12,000 years, we've been telling the story of how the waters came and changed everything. Now finally, we have the geological evidence, the archaeological discoveries, the scientific methods to prove it wasn't just a story, it was history. And the memory of that history, preserved in myths and legends and sacred narratives across every inhabited continent, it's been waiting all this time for us to recognize it for what it really is, not fantasy, not metaphor. But the remembered truth of our species' greatest survival story. But here's what those myths can't tell us. Here's what no amount of storytelling, no matter how faithfully preserved, can recover. The specific details of what was lost, the actual knowledge, the technologies, the innovations that disappeared beneath 400 feet of ocean when the coasts drowned. Because memories fade, details blur. Over 10,000 years, over 400 generations, you can preserve the big picture, the dramatic events, the emotional truth of what happened. But the specifics, the accumulated practical knowledge that took thousands of years to develop, that gets lost. And what we lost when the Ice Age coastlines drowned we'll probably never get back. We'll never even fully know what we're missing. Let's talk about the archaeological void, the blind spot in our understanding of Ice Age humanity that we can't fix no matter how sophisticated our methods become. Here's the fundamental problem. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, the exposed continental shelves were prime real estate, the best territory available, moderate climate, abundant resources, reliable water, easy access to both terrestrial and marine food sources. If you wanted to support large populations, if you wanted to develop sophisticated cultures and technologies, you'd do it on the coasts. That's just logical. That's what humans have always done throughout history. We cluster on coastlines, we build our cities, our centres of innovation and trade, along ocean shores and navigable rivers. There's no reason to think Ice Age humans were any different. In fact, we have every reason to think coastal populations were larger and more advanced than inland populations. But here's the problem. Those coasts are underwater now. Everything that was built within 50 miles of the Ice Age coastline, depending on the local topography, is now beneath the ocean, covered by hundreds of feet of seawater, buried under marine sediment, scoured by 12,000 years of currents, storms and tidal action. The archaeological sites we find and study, the ones that tell us what life was like 20,000 years ago, they're almost all inland. They're the camps and settlements that happen to be far enough from the coast, high enough above sea level, that they didn't drown when the waters rose. But those sites, they might not be representative of mainstream Ice Age culture. They might be the equivalent of studying modern civilization but only having access to sites from rural Montana or the Australian outback or the Sahara Desert. You'd miss the cities entirely. You'd miss the centres of population and innovation. You'd conclude that 21st century humans were sparse, scattered populations with relatively simple technologies. And you'd be completely wrong because you'd be looking at the periphery, not the core. That's the situation we're in with Ice Age humanity. We're studying the survivors, the peripheral sites, the territories that happen to be high enough to escape the floods, the heartland, the core populations, the most developed and sophisticated communities. They were probably on the coasts, and we'll never know what they achieved because it's all underwater. Gone. Inaccessible. Some numbers to put this in perspective. Continental shelves, the shallow underwater extensions of continents, they cover about 27 million square kilometres today. That's an area roughly the size of Africa. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, all of that was dry land. All of it was potentially habitable, and archaeological evidence, the fragmentary bits we've accidentally recovered, suggests much of it was heavily populated. But we can only study maybe 1% of those drowned territories, maybe far less than 1%. The rest is simply too deep, too damaged, too covered in sediment to access with current technology. This means 90%, possibly 95%, of late Ice Age archaeological sites are beyond our reach. Everything we think we know about Ice Age humans, about their technologies and social organisations and cultural achievements, is based on the 5 to 10% of sites that happen to be inland. We're missing the vast majority of the picture, and what we're missing might fundamentally change our understanding of human prehistory. Think about technologies that would have been critical for coastal peoples, but might not show up in the archaeological record. Boat building, for instance. If you're living on Ice Age coasts, you're going to need boats. For fishing, for transportation along the coast, for exploiting offshore resources. The evidence suggests humans had seafaring capabilities much earlier than we used to think. People reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, which required crossing significant stretches of open ocean even when sea levels were lower. That means boats, navigation skills, understanding of currents and weather patterns. But boats don't preserve well, especially wooden boats, which would have been the most likely construction material in most regions. Wood decomposes. Within decades in most environments, within centuries even in ideal conditions. The oldest boat ever found is around 10,000 years old, from the Netherlands, made from a hollowed-out tree trunk. But humans were almost certainly building boats for tens of thousands of years before that. We just don't have the evidence because it rotted away. And the most sophisticated boat-building traditions, the ones developed by coastal populations who depended on maritime technology for survival, those would have been in the coastal communities that are now underwater. What did those boats look like? How large were they? How far could they travel? Did they have sails, outriggers, sophisticated joining techniques that would imply advanced understanding of materials and engineering? We don't know. We'll probably never know. The knowledge died with the boat builders when their communities drowned, and the physical evidence decomposed thousands of years ago. Or consider fishing technologies, nets, traps, hooks, lines, specialized tools for processing fish and shellfish. Some of this shows up in the archaeological record. We find shell middens, enormous piles of discarded shells from countless meals of oysters and clams and mussels. We find bonefish hooks and harpoon points, but these are just the most durable items, the things that happen to preserve. The majority of fishing technology would have been made from materials that decompose, plant fibers woven into nets, wooden fish traps, baskets for collecting shellfish, leather lines, all of it gone, leaving only the most minimal evidence of what must have been incredibly sophisticated and varied technologies developed over thousands of years of coastal living. Architecture is another massive blind spot. The structures that inland Ice Age peoples built, we have some evidence for them. Mammoth bone houses in Eastern Europe, where people used the bones of extinct megafauna as structural supports. Hide tents supported by wooden poles, maybe some simple rock shelters. But these are all small-scale, temporary or semi-permanent structures designed for mobile populations. Coastal populations, with access to more reliable resources and less need to move constantly, might have built more permanent structures. Maybe using wood, which was more abundant near coast than in the colder interior. Maybe using materials that don't preserve or that we wouldn't recognise as architectural if we found them underwater. Some underwater archaeological sites hint at this. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar surveys have identified what might be structural remains. Regular shapes, right angles, features that look potentially artificial. The evidence is controversial. Some researchers think it's natural geological formations. Others argue it's evidence of submerged human settlements, possibly quite large ones. But investigating is incredibly difficult. The sites are deep, visibility is poor, currents are strong, and everything is covered in sediment. Even if these are human structures, even if they represent significant settlements or early cities, recovering enough information to understand them might be impossible with current technology. The Mediterranean has yielded more definitive evidence, submerged settlements off the coast of Greece, Turkey, Italy, places that were clearly built on dry land and occupied for generations before rising seas forced their abandonment. Some show evidence of stone structures, storage areas, tools left behind as people evacuated. But these are relatively shallow sites, close to modern coastlines, representing the last phases of occupation before the final flooding. The deeper sites, the ones that would represent earlier periods when coastlines were even farther out, they're much harder to access, and the earliest sites, the ones that would tell us about coastal cultures from 15 or 20,000 years ago, they're under so much water and sediment that we might never reach them. Japan has the controversial Yonaguni Monument, an underwater formation off the coast of Yonaguni Island that some researchers argue shows signs of artificial shaping. Terraces, apparent steps, angular features that seem too regular to be natural. Skeptics say it's just an unusual geological formation, that the features are explained by the way the local rock naturally fractures and erodes. Believers argue the regularity, the apparent symmetry, the presence of what might be carved symbols or markers, all suggest human modification. Whether it's artificial or natural is still debated. But if it is artificial, if it was carved or shaped by humans, it would have been done when sea levels were lower, when the formation was above water, and that raises questions about what other structures might exist in the drowned landscapes around Japan's coasts, structures we haven't found yet or might never find. But underwater archaeology, as promising as it is, can only recover a tiny fraction of what's down there. The ocean is vast. The drowned continental shelves cover millions of square kilometres. Most of it has never been surveyed, even with basic sonar, and even when we do find sites, excavating them is exponentially more difficult and expensive than land-based archaeology. You need specialised equipment, trained divers, stable funding, permission from multiple governments. You're working in difficult conditions with limited visibility, fighting currents, constrained by dive time limits. And the sites themselves are fragile. Marine organisms cover everything. Sediment buries or scatters artefacts. Wooden structures collapse. The organic materials that would tell us so much about how people lived, they're long decomposed. What this means is that we're left with inference. Educated guesses based on the limited evidence we have and logical assumptions about human behaviour. We know from inland sites that Ice Age humans had sophisticated tool technologies. They were making specialised implements for specific tasks, showing detailed understanding of stone properties and knapping techniques. They had art, cave paintings in France and Spain that demonstrate technical skill and abstract thinking. They had long-distance trade networks. Obsidian and seashells show up, hundreds of miles from their sources, proving different groups were in contact, exchanging goods and probably information. Now extrapolate that to coastal environments with denser populations and more reliable resources. What would you get? Probably more specialisation. If resources are abundant and predictable, you don't need everyone focused on immediate survival. Some people can specialise in boat building while others fish. Some can focus on tool making, while others process food or prepare materials for trade. Specialisation leads to innovation. People who spend their entire lives perfecting one skill will develop techniques and knowledge that generalists never would. You'd probably get more complex social hierarchies. With stored food and accumulated possessions, you need systems to manage distribution and prevent conflict. Leaders who coordinate activities and resolve disputes. Possibly warrior classes to defend against raids, since stored resources are tempting targets. Craftspeople who trade their specialised products for food and protection. This is the beginning of social complexity, the precursors to the class systems that would later define agricultural civilizations. You might get early experiments with plant and animal management. Coastal peoples would have been in close contact with diverse species. They'd have noticed which plants were most productive, which animals were most easily managed. Maybe they started encouraging useful plants, protecting them from competition, even transplanting them to convenient locations. Maybe they started managing populations of certain prey animals, protecting juveniles to ensure future harvests. Not full domestication, not agriculture as we understand it, but the first steps in that direction. Or maybe they developed technologies we've never imagined because we have no evidence they ever existed. Navigation techniques that would have allowed long-distance sea travel, connecting populations across vast distances. Astronomical knowledge used for timekeeping and navigation, understanding of tides and currents sophisticated enough to predict safe passages. Methods for preserving food that allowed them to store surplus fish or marine mammals, creating the first stored wealth, the first economic inequality, the first need for social systems to manage distribution. Textile production, if they'd figured out how to process plant fibers or animal materials into thread and fabric. This might seem basic, but textiles require multiple technological innovations. You need to identify useful fibers, develop methods to process them, invent tools for spinning thread and weaving fabric. Inland archaeological sites rarely preserve textiles because organic materials decompose. But coastal peoples, with access to both plant and animal fibers, might have developed sophisticated textile traditions. Clothing that was more than just animal hides. Maybe decorated fabrics, patterns and designs that encoded cultural, informational status, maybe sails for boats, nets for fishing, cordage for countless applications, an entire technological complex that left almost no trace because everything rotted away thousands of years ago. The loss extends beyond technology to knowledge systems, ways of understanding the world, of organizing information, of transmitting learning across generations. Coastal peoples would have needed detailed ecological knowledge, understanding seasonal patterns of fish migration, shellfish availability, bird nesting, marine mammal movements. This knowledge would have been accumulated over thousands of years, refined by countless observations, passed down through teaching and storytelling. It would have been incredibly sophisticated, probably comparable to or exceeding the ecological knowledge of modern indigenous peoples who still maintain traditional subsistence practices. But when the coasts drowned, when populations were displaced and scattered, much of that specific knowledge would have been lost. The information was tied to specific places, specific species, specific local conditions. If you're forced to abandon your traditional territory and move to a completely different environment, your accumulated ecological knowledge becomes useless. You have to start over, learning new landscapes, new species, new patterns. Some general principles might transfer, but the detailed, place-specific knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate, it's gone. And because it was never written down, because it existed only in oral tradition and direct teaching, when the people who held it died or dispersed, it died with them, languages too. Each coastal population would have had its own language, its own way of encoding and expressing ideas. When those populations drowned or were displaced, when communities fractured and scattered, many languages must have disappeared. Replaced by the languages of the inland groups, they merged with or overwhelmed by new languages developing in the post-flood chaos as refugees from multiple backgrounds tried to communicate and cooperate. We know from historical examples that languages can disappear in just a few generations when populations are displaced and younger people adopt new languages for survival. How many languages died when the coast drowned? Hundreds? Thousands? We'll never know, because pre-literate languages leave no record beyond their influence on descendant languages, and after 12,000 years, even that influence is undetectable. Cultural practices, rituals, art forms, stories, belief systems, all of it tied to specific coastal landscapes and the populations who inhabited them. Some would have been preserved, transformed, integrated into the cultures that emerged after the flood. But much would have been lost, art that used materials that don't preserve, songs and stories about specific places that no longer existed, rituals tied to local landmarks that were now underwater, belief systems that made sense in coastal environments but became irrelevant inland. The cultural diversity of Ice Age coastal populations, the richness of human expression and creativity developed over thousands of years in dozens of different environments, most of it vanished without trace. And here's perhaps the most haunting aspect of this loss. We don't even know what we're missing. We can't point to specific technologies or knowledge systems and say, this existed and was lost. We can only acknowledge the void, the absence, the realization that our picture of Ice Age humanity is fundamentally incomplete and possibly fundamentally wrong. We're making conclusions about human capabilities and cultural development based on maybe 5 to 10% of the evidence. The other 90% is underwater, and most of it will stay there, inaccessible, slowly degrading, becoming more impossible to recover with each passing decade. It's like trying to understand modern civilization but only being able to study rural villages, while all the cities, universities, research centers, manufacturing facilities, everything that represents the pinnacle of contemporary human achievement, it's all forbidden territory. You couldn't. You'd get the basics right, maybe. You'd understand that humans use tools, form social groups, have language and culture, but you'd miss the complexity, the sophistication, the full range of what humans are capable of achieving. And that's where we are with Ice Age coastal populations. We're missing the complexity, we're missing the pinnacle. We're looking at the shadows and thinking we see the full picture. The floods didn't just drown landscapes. They drowned human potential. They destroyed thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and innovation. They forced humanity to start over in many ways, to rebuild cultural complexity from whatever fragments survived the displacement and chaos. We adapted, yes. We eventually exceeded whatever we'd achieved before. But the path was longer because we'd lost so much. The knowledge that had to be rediscovered, The innovations that had to be reinvented, the insights that were simply gone forever because nobody who survived carried them to the new world. We'll never get it back. We can't undo the floods. We can't drain the oceans and reclaim those drowned territories. The best we can do is acknowledge the loss, understand that our ancestors were probably far more sophisticated than the archaeological record suggests, and accept that 12,000 years ago humanity lost something precious and irreplaceable when the ice melted and the world changed forever. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of the catastrophe. Something that might not have happened if the floods hadn't forced it. Humanity didn't just survive the drowning of the ancient world, we transformed. We became something entirely different from what we'd been before. And everything we now call civilization, everything that defines human society for the last 10,000 years, it all emerged from the descendants of those climate refugees who watched their world disappear beneath the waves. The displacement was massive. Millions of people, possibly tens of millions by the end of the flooding period, forced to abandon coastal territories and move inland. Not in one organised migration, but in waves, over thousands of years, as different coastlines drowned at different rates. Each wave of refugees had to find somewhere to go, had to compete with populations already there, had to adapt to environments they weren't familiar with. It was chaos. It was violent in many places, but it was also the forcing mechanism that pushed humanity toward complexity. Because here's what the floods did. They concentrated populations. During the Ice Age, when coastlines extended much farther out and resources were abundant and spread across vast territories, human groups could remain small and dispersed. 30 people here, 50 people there, each group occupying its own territory with minimal interaction beyond occasional trade or seasonal gatherings. There was space. There was no pressure to develop large-scale social organisation because small groups worked fine. The floods changed that. Suddenly, habitable territory was reduced. The best land, the coastal plains, they were underwater. What remained was smaller, more constrained. And into that constrained space came waves of refugees from the drowning coasts. Groups that had been able to avoid each other were suddenly forced into proximity, into competition, into cooperation. You couldn't just move away from neighbours you didn't like anymore because there was nowhere else to go that wasn't already occupied. This forced innovation in social organisation. Small kinship groups, the extended family bands that had worked for tens of thousands of years, they weren't sufficient anymore. You needed systems for managing relationships between multiple groups. Ways to resolve conflicts without constant warfare. Methods for coordinating resource use when multiple groups were exploiting the same territories. Leadership structures that could command authority beyond immediate family relationships. Anthropologists call these developments tribal organizations. Multiple family groups united under shared identity, shared leadership, shared rules. It's the beginning of social complexity beyond kinship, the first steps toward the elaborate hierarchies and institutions that would later characterize civilizations. And it emerged, at least in part, because the floods forced people together in ways that made simple, family-based organization insufficient. But the most dramatic transformation came from a different kind of pressure. The megafauna were dying. Those massive Ice Age animals that humans had been hunting for millennia, mammoths and giant sloths and woolly rhinoceroses, they were going extinct. Partly from climate change, partly from human hunting. Pressure. But the result was the same. The easy protein, the massive food packages that could feed a group for weeks, they were disappearing. And coastal resources, the shellfish and seabirds and fish that had supplemented terrestrial hunting, they were increasingly unavailable as coastlines retreated and populations were pushed inland. Humans needed new food strategies, desperately, and they found them in river valleys. Because while the floods had destroyed the coastal plains, they'd also created something else. Predictable annual flooding in major river systems, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt, the Indus in what's now Pakistan, the Yellow River in China. These rivers, fed by mountain snowmelt and monsoon rains, they flooded every year like clockwork, and the floods deposited nutrient-rich sediment across their floodplains, creating incredibly fertile soil that was naturally irrigated and fertilized. Imagine you're a refugee from the drowned Persian Gulf Valley around 10,000 years ago. Your ancestors lived on the coast, exploited marine resources, had a comfortable life for generations. Now you're inland, in the river valleys north of where the Gulf has formed, trying to figure out how to survive in this new world. The hunting isn't great. The megafauna your grandparents hunted are mostly gone. The animals that remain are smaller, harder to catch, provide less food per kill. But you notice something. Every spring the rivers flood. The water rises, spreads across the floodplain, then recedes. And where the floodwaters reached, plants grow more vigorously. The soil is richer, darker. Seeds that fall in these flood zones after the water retreats, they sprout readily, grow faster than plants elsewhere, and you start to wonder, what if, instead of just gathering wild plants where they happen to grow, you deliberately scattered seeds in the flood zones after the water receded? Would they grow? Could you essentially farm the flood cycle? This is the beginning of agriculture, not a sudden invention, not one person having a brilliant insight, but a gradual process of experimentation and observation by people who had no choice but to find new food sources. People who'd lost their traditional territories and traditional subsistence strategies and had to innovate or starve. The earliest evidence of systematic agriculture appears in exactly these river valleys. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and the Levant, shows signs of deliberate plant cultivation by around 10,000 years ago. Wheat and barley, wild species that humans began encouraging, protecting, eventually selectively breeding into more productive domesticated forms. Not because agriculture was easier than hunting and gathering, it wasn't. Early agriculture was harder work, more time-consuming, less reliable in many ways, but it was scalable. One person farming could produce more food than one person. Hunting, especially as large game became scarce. And that surplus production, that ability to grow more than you immediately needed, it changed everything. Because surplus food meant you could support specialists. People who didn't have to spend all their time producing food could do other things, make better tools, build more permanent structures, create art, develop new technologies, and surplus food meant population growth. More reliable calories meant lower infant mortality, better overall health, faster population increase. The communities practicing agriculture began growing, expanding, developing complexity that hunting and gathering societies rarely achieved. Egypt developed along similar lines. The Nile's annual flood was even more predictable than Mesopotamian rivers. Every summer, like clockwork, the river would rise, inundate the floodplain, then recede, leaving behind fertile black silt. Early Egyptian societies learned to time their planting to this cycle, scatter seeds after the flood recedes, harvest before the next flood, store the surplus. Within a few thousand years, they developed one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems in the ancient world, capable of feeding populations in the millions. The Indus Valley civilization, which emerged slightly later, around 5,000 years ago, showed even more sophisticated water management. Planned cities with advanced drainage systems, wells and public baths, irrigation canals that directed water from the Indus River to agricultural fields during dry seasons. This wasn't just farming. This was engineering on a scale that required centralized planning, coordinated labor, mathematical understanding of water flow and distribution. China's early agricultural societies along the Yellow River developed their own innovations. Millet cultivation, adapted to the local climate, early irrigation systems that would eventually become the massive water control projects of later Chinese dynasties. And like everywhere else, this agricultural development was concentrated in river valleys, where flooding provided natural irrigation and fertilization. Notice the pattern. Every early civilization emerged in a river valley. Every one. Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River in China, later civilizations in the Indus tributaries, along the Ganges, in Mesoamerica along smaller river systems. This isn't coincidence. This is cause and effect. The floods that destroyed the coastal world created the conditions that made agriculture possible, and agriculture made civilization possible. But agriculture created new problems that required new solutions. Annual flooding is productive, but it's also destructive. Too much water and your crops drown, your settlements flood, your stored grain gets destroyed. Too little water and everything dies of drought. You need to control the water flow, channel it where you want it, store it for dry periods. Drain it when there's too much. This requires engineering, large-scale construction projects, levees to prevent flooding, canals to redirect water, reservoirs to store surplus, drainage systems to prevent waterlogging, and these projects require something that small groups can't provide. Coordinated labour, hundreds, eventually thousands of people working together on shared infrastructure. which requires organization, leadership, authority structures that can command obedience from people who aren't related to you by blood. The first governments weren't political bodies in any modern sense. They were water management authorities, organizations that controlled irrigation, decided who got water when, maintained the infrastructure that everyone depended on for survival. With government came other innovations. You need to track who contributed what labour to the shared projects, who owns which fields, how much harvest each field produces, how much is owed in taxes or tribute to support the people managing the water systems and the soldiers protecting the infrastructure. This requires record keeping. At first, probably simple tally marks or tokens representing quantities. But over time, these systems became more sophisticated. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia developed cuneiform writing around 5,200 years ago, initially for accounting, for tracking grain stores and water distribution. Only later did it expand to literature and history, and all the other things we associate with writing. Egypt developed hieroglyphics around the same time. The Indus Valley had its own script that we still haven't deciphered. China developed its writing system somewhat later, but followed a similar trajectory, from administrative records to broader applications. And in every case, writing emerged from the need to manage the complex systems required for agricultural civilization. Systems that wouldn't have been necessary if people were still living on the drowned coasts, following mobile lifestyles, exploiting diverse resources that didn't require large-scale infrastructure. Within just 5,000 years of the major floods, which is nothing in terms of human evolutionary history, humans had gone from small mobile hunter-gatherer bands to massive urban civilizations, cities like Uruk in Mesopotamia, with populations in the tens of thousands. Elaborate temples and palaces showing architectural sophistication that would have been impossible without large coordinated workforces, standing armies to protect agricultural wealth and water infrastructure, complex religious systems with professional priests managing relationships with gods who, significantly, often controlled water and floods, writing systems that preserved knowledge across generations, mathematics for calculating areas, volumes, distribution quotas, the beginnings of science, of systematic observation and prediction of natural phenomena necessary for managing agricultural cycles. All of this, the entire edifice of what we call civilization, built by the descendants of climate refugees, people who'd been forced from their homes by rising water, who'd lost their traditional territories and ways of life, who'd had to innovate and adapt and create entirely new social systems just to survive. The floods didn't just kill millions and destroy landscapes, they destroyed the old human way of life and forced us to invent a new one. But there's a deeper legacy, a psychological scar that every culture that emerged from the floods carried forward. Because the experience of watching the world drown, of seeing landscapes that had existed for millennia simply disappear, of understanding that nature could destroy everything humans had built, it changed how people thought about their place in the world. Look at the religious systems that developed in post-flood civilizations. They're obsessed with divine judgment and catastrophe. The idea that gods could destroy the world and remake it, that human survival was contingent on proper behavior, proper tribute, proper management of relationships with supernatural powers. This is apocalyptic thinking. The belief that the world could end, that everything could be swept away, that only the righteous or the lucky would survive. And where did this come from? It came from lived experience, from cultural memories of when it actually happened, when the world actually did end in flood, and survivors had to rebuild from nothing. The Mesopotamians believed the gods created humans specifically to manage irrigation and agriculture, to prevent the flooding chaos that had existed before civilization. The Egyptians saw the Nile's flooding as a manifestation of divine order that had to be maintained through ritual and proper kingship. The Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven included the idea that rulers who failed to manage water properly would lose legitimacy and be overthrown. Water management and divine favour were intrinsically linked across multiple cultures because the floods had taught everyone the same lesson: control water or die. And controlling water required not just engineering but proper relationship with the forces, whether natural or supernatural, that controlled the water's flow. This worldview, this understanding of human vulnerability in the face of natural catastrophe, it's still with us. The expectation that the world could end, that civilization is fragile, that we're just one disaster away from collapse. We didn't get this from philosophy or abstract thinking. We got it from 12,000 years of cultural memory, from stories passed down through hundreds of generations about the time when the world actually did end and humanity barely survived. And here's the thing, we never recovered. Not really. We didn't rebuild the Ice Age coastal world. We couldn't. It was underwater. Instead, we built something entirely different. Cities instead of mobile camps. Agriculture instead of hunting and gathering. Writing instead of purely oral tradition. Hierarchical societies instead of egalitarian bands. Warfare over resources instead of simply moving when conflicts arose. All the characteristics that define post-flood civilization, they emerged because the floods made the old way of life impossible. We became something different. Not better necessarily. Not worse. Just different. We gained complexity, technology, the ability to support larger populations and develop specialized knowledge. We built monuments that lasted millennia, created art and literature that still moves us, developed philosophical and scientific traditions that expanded human understanding of the universe. But we lost something too, the mobility, the intimate knowledge of landscapes we no longer occupy, the cultural diversity of dozens of sophisticated coastal societies, the technologies and innovations that drowned with them, the direct connection to environments and ecosystems that fed us for tens of thousands of years. Every human alive today is descended from survivors, from people who watched their world drown and somehow found a way forward, who adapted to the new landscapes, who invented agriculture and cities and writing and all the tools of civilization. We're all children of the flood, living in the world it created, building on foundations laid by refugees who had no choice but to become something humanity had never been before. And we've never stopped being those refugees, never fully settled into this new world, because somewhere in our cultural memory we remember that it all can be taken away, that the water can rise, that the world can change, that survival requires constant adaptation and vigilance. That's why we never recovered from the Great Flood. Because recovery would mean going back to what we were before, and that's impossible. The coastlines are gone. The Ice Age world is drowned. We can't return to it even if we wanted to. All we can do is keep moving forward, carrying the memories, building on the ruins of what was lost, hoping that this time, this world we've built, it might last a little longer than the one that came before. So here we are, you and me, 12,000 years after the waters rose and changed everything. You're lying somewhere in the world right now, maybe in a coastal city that wouldn't have existed during the Ice Age, maybe inland on territory that was once the refuge where displaced populations rebuilt their lives. The device you're listening on, the language you understand, the civilization that made both of those things possible, all of it traces back to that catastrophe, to the moment when the ice melted and the seas rose and humanity had to become something different just to survive. You're not separate from this story, you're living it. Every human alive today is part of the unbroken chain of survivors stretching back to when the old world drowned. Your ancestors, somewhere in your lineage, they watched coastlines retreat. They fled rising waters. They adapted to new territories, learned new ways of living, passed their knowledge and their trauma and their resilience down through 400 generations until it reached you. The flood never really ended. We're still living in its aftermath. Still shaped by the choices those refugees made when they had nowhere left to go but inland, when they had no choice but to invent agriculture and cities and all the complexity we now take for granted. The world we inhabit, the one with higher seas and drowned continental shelves and river valley civilizations, it's the world the floods created. We've never recovered because there's nothing to recover to. The Ice Age coastlines are gone forever, and we're something different now than what we were before, but we're still here. Still adapting, still carrying forward the knowledge and the memories, still telling the story of how the waters came and we survived. If you enjoyed this journey through deep time, maybe hit that like button and leave a comment telling me where you are in the world as you drift off. I love seeing Melbourne at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, Seoul in the afternoon. All of us scattered across this changed planet, all of us descendants of the same survivors. Sleep well, rest easy. You're part of a story that's been unfolding for 12,000 years, and tonight, you get to close your eyes and dream while the world keeps turning. The tides keep rising and falling, and humanity keeps moving forward, carrying the memory of the great flood that changed us forever. Sweet dreams.